January 1889, the 8th night of the blizzard. At 47 below zero, the cold was no longer just weather, it was death. The furious storm swallowed Judith Basin, burying fences and making timber walls groan under the strain. Across the settlement, people desperately fed their own furniture into glowing iron stoves. Children slept huddled in heavy coats. But inside this small Ponderosa pine cabin, the scene was strikingly different. 9-year-old Eli Voss slept soundly beneath a single, thin wool blanket. Nearly 2 tons of brick and sandstone still quietly radiated heat, even though the fire had burned out hours ago. Martha Voss calmly set a loaf of bread near the masonry, making use of the steady, comforting warmth it still provided. Across the room, Finnick Voss rested a hand on the warm stone and quietly listened to the howling storm. Suddenly, 3 heavy knocks cut through the wind. A figure stood rooted in the blinding snow. It was Abram Voss, the brother who had once ruthlessly forced Finnick off the family farm. But before that door swung open, the reckoning had already begun 8 months earlier. Spring of 1888 found Finnick Voss still living on the farm his father had left to the 2 brothers at the edge of Judith Basin. For years, Finnick had been the man who checked a harness twice before a trip. He dug drainage ditches before the rains arrived. He stored more seed than most farmers considered necessary. When others saw a good season, he thought about the next bad one. That habit had become a problem. The farm had endured 2 weak years. Payments on a hay mower were still hanging over the family. Abram Voss watched every dollar carefully and saw little value in projects that might never be needed. He wanted more cattle, more pasture, more production. Finnick wanted stronger barns, a larger hay shed, and a food cellar dug before winter. The disagreement never turned into a shouting match. That made it harder. One evening, while the sun was dropping behind the cottonwoods, Abram told his younger brother that he spent so much time preparing for disasters that he no longer seemed able to live through ordinary days. A week later, Finnick received a poorer piece of land north of the basin, an aging wagon, and instructions to leave before those preparations consumed resources the farm could not spare. Martha gathered what the family owned. Finnick loaded tools into the wagon. Eli sat quietly beside a sack of seed corn. As the wagon rolled away, the boy kept looking back at his grandfather's house until the cottonwoods swallowed it from view. Finnick never turned around. The new parcel sat well north of the main settlement beside a seasonal creek that ran strong in spring and nearly vanished by late summer. The soil was poor. Growing crops there would never be easy. Still, the land offered other things. Ponderosa pines stood along the ridge. Sandstone outcrops broke through the earth in several places. A low rise helped blunt some of the western wind. Before autumn arrived, Finnick built an 18 by 20-foot cabin. The front door faced southeast. Fewer windows looked north. Gaps between the logs were sealed with clay, ash, and dried grass fibers. While working, he often remembered 2 winters spent building stone culverts for a railroad crew. An elderly Russian mason on that job had constructed a squat brick stove inside the camp shelter. The fire burned hot for only a few hours. Afterward, the flames died, yet the building remained warm nearly all day. The old mason had explained it simply. Fire was not there to heat the room. Fire was there to charge the stone. By September, geese were already moving south. Frost appeared earlier than expected. One evening, Finnick unfolded an old freight receipt and spread it across the table. On the back was a rough sketch he had carried for years. Martha looked from the drawing to the small pile of money they had left. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Finnick reached for a pencil and began making measurements. The decision to build the brick stove had been made. The plan looked expensive because it was expensive. Finnick did not have enough money to buy new materials, so he searched for them instead. Near an abandoned ore-testing furnace outside an old mining camp, he found stacks of discarded fire brick. Many were cracked. Some were stained with slag. Others had absorbed years of rain and frost. He tested each one by tapping it with a hammer handle. A clear ring meant the brick was sound. A dull thud sent it into a separate pile. The outer shell would come from reclaimed red brick and local sandstone. Mortar was mixed from heat-resistant clay, screened river sand, and a small amount of lime purchased in town. By his estimate, the finished stove would weigh close to 2 tons. That created another problem. The cabin floor could never support that much weight. Several boards near the center of the room came up. Finnick dug down to firm ground and built an independent stone foundation beneath the future stove, keeping the load away from the wooden floor joists. Each wagon trip brought more brick and stone. Each trip also reduced the family's remaining savings. After paying for lime, a cast iron stove door, and a section of stovepipe, Martha spread their money across the table and counted it twice. The total was enough for flour, salt, and lamp oil until midwinter. A small iron stove could have been purchased within days. Instead, weeks disappeared into hauling stone. One evening, Eli finished counting bricks on the wagon, leaned against a sack of sand, and fell asleep before supper. Nearby, Martha quietly crossed a bolt of cloth from her shopping list and folded the paper. She never mentioned it. Word of the project spread faster than the stove itself. The first visitor was Caleb Mercer, a neighboring settler who had recently installed a new sheet iron stove. It heated his cabin within minutes, and he was proud of it. Caleb studied the growing pile of brick, then glanced toward the mountains already collecting early snow. His concern sounded genuine. Winter would not wait for unfinished masonry. If the project failed, he told Finnick, there would always be room for Martha and Eli at his place. A few days later, Jeremiah Boone, the region's respected blacksmith, stopped by to inspect the cast iron stove door leaning against the wall. He listened patiently as Finnick described the design, then shook his head. In Jeremiah's view, heat belonged in the air, not trapped inside a mountain of brick. Giving nearly a fifth of a cabin to a stove seemed like poor planning. Silas Crow saw the matter through a different lens. As the man who cut, hauled, and sold firewood across the basin, he believed most heating problems had the same solution. More wood, 6 cords of dry pine, he offered. Payment could wait until spring. Around the settlement, opinions followed similar lines. Ruth Mercer, Caleb's wife, quietly suggested to Martha that a husband should know when persistence stopped being wisdom and started becoming risk. The last visitor arrived while driving cattle toward town. Abram reined in his horse and stared at the stone foundation, the missing section of floor, and the stacks of brick crowding the yard. Nothing about the scene surprised him. According to Abram, Finnick was still building for disasters that had not happened while his family lived on what remained afterward. Mortar slid from the trowel onto the growing wall. Finnick kept working. Eli stacked bricks nearby. Martha listened. The criticism lingered longer than the voices that carried it. Construction slowed once the outer walls gave way to the inner workings of the stove. This was the part most people would never see. Finnick built the firebox from the best fire brick he had salvaged. It was sized for short, intense burns rather than a slow fire that smoldered all day. The goal was not to stretch the flames. The goal was to burn hot enough to consume smoke and push as much energy as possible into the masonry. Behind the firebox, 3 shaped channels wound through the body of the stove. Hot gases would not be allowed to race straight into the chimney. Instead, they would travel down, across, and upward again through the brickwork. Every turn gave the masonry more time to absorb heat before the smoke finally escaped. Small clean-out doors were built at the bottom of each channel. A narrow expansion gap separated the inner firebrick core from teehee outer shell, allowing both layers to move slightly as temperatures changed. Eli carried marked bricks one at a time and handed them to his father. Nearby, Martha sifted sand through a screen, removing pebbles that could weaken the mortar. Progress felt painfully slow. During the same weeks, Caleb's iron stove had already been installed, connected, and tested several times. Each evening, after the day's work ended, Finnick covered the fresh masonry with burlap. Mortar that dried too quickly could crack. Mortar that froze too soon could fail. The stove grew one careful layer at a time. One afternoon, Eli pointed to a flat sandstone slab resting beside the wall and asked if it would be part of the sleeping platform. Finnick smiled faintly and rested a hand on the stone. According to the plan, that piece would sit directly beneath the warmest place in the house. It would still be giving back heat long after the fire was gone. By early October, The stove stood nearly 6 feet tall. The upper section looked stranger than anything most settlers had ever seen. Instead of ending with a flat top, it widened into a raised sleeping platform 8 feet long and 4 feet across. Smooth sandstone slabs formed the surface. A short wooden ladder leaned against one side. Eli climbed onto it the moment the last stone was set. Martha was less enthusiastic. Her concern had little to do with appearances. Too much heat could crack stone. Too much heat could also make the platform impossible to sleep on. Finnick explained that the bed was not sitting directly above the firebox. By the time hot gases reached that section, much of their energy would already have been absorbed by the channels below. The warmth would arrive slowly and evenly. The stove occupied the center of the cabin for a reason. Every side of the masonry faced living space, rather than an exterior wall. Heat leaving the brick would stay inside the home, instead of being wasted against cold timber and winter wind. That decision came at a cost. The table moved closer to a window. One storage cabinet had to be cut down and rebuilt. The walkway through the room became noticeably narrower. When Ruth Mercer stopped by one afternoon, she stood in the doorway for several seconds before laughing softly. From her perspective, Finnick had built a house for a stove and squeezed his family into whatever space remained. The remark stayed in the room after she left. That evening, Martha carried a folded blanket up the ladder and spread it across the cold sandstone. She sat there for a moment, looking at the platform and the unfinished stove beneath it. There was enough room for all three of them. When she climbed down, the blanket remained where it was. By late November, the mortar had cured enough for the first fire. Finnick started cautiously. Only a small load of dry pine went into the firebox. At first, everything behaved exactly as planned. Flames pulled cleanly through the chamber. Heat moved into the brickwork. The draft seemed steady. Then the wind shifted. A strong northwest gust rolled across the ridge and struck the chimney. Deep inside the stove, the movement of smoke slowed. Seconds later, pressure pushed downward through the flue. Smoke spilled back through the stove door. The change happened fast. Within minutes, a gray haze spread across the cabin. Eli began coughing. Martha grabbed him and hurried outside while Finnick threw open a window and reduced the fire. The little warmth already inside the house escaped with the smoke. Seeing the door standing open in the cold, Caleb crossed the yard to help. Jeremiah arrived soon afterward. The blacksmith did not say, "I told you so." He did not need to. His expression carried enough doubt for everyone present. Once the fire was out, Finnick started checking the system, piece by piece. The clean-out doors were clear. None of the channels had collapsed. The mortar remained intact. That left the chimney. Lantern light revealed the problem. The flue ended too low behind the roof ridge, directly inside a turbulent pressure zone created by northwest winds. The stove itself was functioning. The chimney was not. Long after dark, Finnick removed the upper section. The next morning, he added 18 inches of pipe and sealed a small joint with clay-soaked fiber cord. By evening, the repair was finished. The smoke was gone, but evidence of the failure remained behind. A faint black stain marked the ceiling. The blankets carried the smell of soot. Standing beside Martha, Finnick watched Eli rub tired eyes after a restless night. For the first time since leaving the family farm, his preparations had placed the people he cared about in danger instead of protecting them. 2 days later, the wind returned from the northwest. Finnick waited for it. There was little value in testing the stove under easy conditions. The repair had to face the same weather that had exposed the flaw. A moderate load of dry pine went into the firebox. For the first few minutes, he left the stove door slightly open, allowing the chimney to warm and establish a strong draft. Everyone watched. The flames leaned inward. Smoke moved cleanly through the channels. Outside, a thin gray plume rose from the chimney and disappeared into the wind. Nothing spilled back into the room. The first hours were not especially impressive. Caleb's iron stove still heated a cabin faster. Much of the fire's energy vanished into the mass of brick and stone, making the criticism seem reasonable. Then the fire began to fade. That was when the difference appeared. Warmth slowly spread through the masonry, traveling along the hidden channels from the lower sections upward. By evening, The sleeping platform felt like sandstone that had spent an entire afternoon in summer sunlight. Before going to bed, Finnick opened a small notebook and made a single entry. He recorded the amount of wood burned, the outdoor temperature, and the temperature he would check the following morning. The answer came after nearly 9 hours, without adding fuel. Outside, the thermometer showed 7 degrees above zero. Inside, the living area remained above 54. The platform was warmer still. That night, Martha folded away one of the heavy blankets. Only 2 remained on the bed. Eli slept through the darkness without his coat. Near dawn, Martha woke out of habit and listened for the familiar sounds of winter. The creak of a floorboard, the opening of a stove door, the scrape of wood being added to a fire. The cabin was quiet. There was no fire to tend. After a moment, she settled back beneath the blanket and closed her eyes again. December passed in steady cold. The settlement endured it without much trouble. Snow came and went. Water troughs froze overnight. Frost gathered along window edges. None of it felt unusual for Montana. At the Voss cabin, the stove settled into a rhythm. One strong fire late each afternoon. Occasionally a smaller burn in the morning. The rest of the time, the brickwork handled the job alone. Martha learned to use the stored heat. Water stayed warm longer. Bread baked evenly after the flames were gone. By Christmas, the woodpile beside the cabin had shrunk far less than she expected. Then the first week of January arrived. The changes were subtle at first. Cattle stood with their backs toward the north, even when the wind remained light. Crows abandoned fence posts and disappeared into the timber. A strange blue-gray color spread across the sky. One morning turned slightly warmer than normal. By afternoon, the barometer was falling fast. Around the basin, preparations accelerated. Silas Crow received more requests for firewood than he could fill. His seasoned stock was nearly gone. Much of what remained had been cut recently and still carried moisture. Jeremiah Boone advised families to keep fires burning around the clock. Caleb Mercer began moving extra wood indoors before drifting snow could bury it. Abram Voss stayed busy protecting his cattle and saw little reason for concern. The old farm still held a large wood supply, and he trusted it. Finnick trusted something else. He sealed a few remaining cracks around the door, checked every clean-out opening in the stove, and moved additional dry fuel inside. The basin remained quiet. No storm had arrived, yet the feeling was there. Time itself seemed to be getting shorter. As dusk settled over the ridge, Finnick looked toward the direction of Abram's farm. No lantern moved across the distance. No wagon traveled the road. A few minutes later, he closed the door against the first cold gust of the evening. And just like that, the final silence of the valley was shattered. The wind arrived after sunset. Within 3 hours, the temperature in Judith Basin plunged from 11 degrees above zero to more than 20 below. Snow did not fall in soft flakes. It raced across the ground like pale sand, swallowing tracks almost as soon as they appeared. Each family responded, according to what they trusted. Caleb Mercer filled his sheet iron stove and stacked extra firewood inside the cabin. Heat rushed into the room. His children soon backed away from the stove door because it had become too hot to stand near. Jeremiah Boone sealed every gap around his chimney and kept a steady fire burning in the heavy cast-iron stove he had built with his own hands. Good metalwork and constant flame had carried him through many winters before. Silas Crow harnessed a team for one last delivery run. 2 families south of the basin still expected firewood before the storm deepened. He intended to get it there. At the Voss cabin, Finnick followed a different routine. A measured load of dry pine filled the firebox. The burn was hot, clean, and deliberate. When the flames settled into coals, he reduced the airflow, but left the draft open long enough for the system to finish its work. Hidden inside the stove, the 3 winding channels began storing the heat produced during those 2 hours. Martha set extra water and hard bread near the warm masonry. Eli dragged the ladder closer to the sleeping platform. Meanwhile, less than half a mile from his woodyard, Silas encountered a drift high enough to stop the horses. The animals leaned into their harnesses and went nowhere. The wagon turned around. Behind him sat a yard full of firewood. Ahead of him waited families who would never receive it. The storm had only begun, yet one assumption had already disappeared. Getting more fuel would no longer be simple. At Finnick's cabin, the first night passed without drama. That was what made it unusual. When Finnick closed the stove for the final time that evening, the cabin was not overflowing with heat. Nobody had to move away from the masonry. No corner of the room felt stifling. Warmth simply spread through the brickwork and settled there. Before climbing onto the sleeping platform, Martha followed habits learned over many winters. She placed gloves and a coat within easy reach. If the temperature dropped during the night, someone would have to get up and feed the fire. Hours passed. Nobody moved. Around 3 in the morning, Martha woke briefly. At first, she could not identify what had disturbed her. Then she realized something was missing. There was no sound of a stove door opening, no footsteps crossing the floor, no crack of fresh wood being added to a fire. Beyond the north wall, wind continued to press against the cabin. Beneath the blankets, steady warmth rose from the stone platform. She reached down and touched the sandstone. The surface was no longer hot. It was simply warm. Down below, Finnick noticed a different issue. Moisture from cooking and breathing had begun collecting on the windows. Thin ice formed along the edges of the glass. The cabin held heat efficiently, but it also held humidity. For a few minutes, he opened a small vent near the upper wall on the sheltered side of the house. Damp air escaped. Most of the stored heat remained where it belonged. Morning arrived under a sky of blowing snow. Finnick checked the thermometer once. Nearly 10 hours had passed since the last fire. Outside, the temperature hovered close to 31 below zero. Inside, the main living area remained above 55 degrees. He recorded a single line in his notebook and closed it. The more convincing evidence rested a few feet away. Eli was still asleep. His socks lay beside him instead of on his feet. In the days that followed, peace slowly vanished from the basin. By the 4th day, the storm showed no sign of weakening. The struggle had changed. Temperature alone was no longer the problem. At Caleb Mercer's cabin, life revolved around the stove. Whenever exhaustion kept him asleep a little too long, the fire settled, and the room began losing heat almost immediately. Ruth and the children had abandoned the bedrooms altogether. The family now lived in a shrinking circle around the iron stove. A worn bench came apart next. Dry furniture burned well. It simply did not burn for long. Each piece bought a little time before the cycle started again. Several miles away, Jeremiah Boone faced a different loss. His heavy cast-iron stove still performed exactly as designed, but wood vanished faster than expected. Spare tool handles disappeared into the fire. Rough stock intended for spring repairs followed. Every warm evening consumed part of the coming season's work. Silas Crow endured the cruelest irony of all. His woodyard remained full. The problem was reaching it. Drifts had sealed off the open space between the house and the storage piles. The fuel he managed to bring indoors before the storm was nearly gone. Fresh-cut pine became the only option. The logs hissed. Steam escaped from the ends. Smoke thickened. Heat lagged behind. Several times, wind pushed down the chimney hard enough to fill the room with fumes. Each time Silas opened a door to clear the air, precious warmth escaped into the storm. Nobody spent much energy arguing about heating methods anymore. Conversations had become simpler. People counted what remained. A chair, a tool handle, a stack of lumber. One evening, Jeremiah stood beside the stove, holding a newly finished hammer handle. He had shaped it only weeks earlier. After a long moment, he fed it into the fire. The flames took it quickly. Abram Voss had always considered the family farm proof that he was right. The house was larger than Finnick's cabin. A proper barn stood nearby. Hay filled the sheds. A sizable woodpile waited beside the yard. Under normal conditions, it would have carried the family through winter without difficulty. These were not normal conditions. Part of the wood shelter collapsed under wind and drifting snow. Logs stacked along the outer edge became damp. When brought near the stove, they sweated moisture before they burned. The chimney created another problem. Built low on the sheltered side of the roof, it repeatedly lost its draft when powerful gusts rolled over the ridge. Abram fed more wood into the fire. Smoke pushed back into the room. He opened the door to clear the air, and freezing wind followed it inside. The youngest child had developed a persistent cough. His older son sat so close to the stove that one corner of a blanket had been scorched brown. Even then, the boy's shoulders still trembled. That evening, Abram's wife asked how much dry wood remained. He took longer than usual to answer. A few minutes later, he walked into the room that had once belonged to Finnick. Several old tools still rested on a shelf. A spirit level, a masonry trowel, a worn measuring line. The sight of them stirred memories Abram had spent months dismissing. Drainage ditches dug before storms, emergency stores packed before winter, repairs completed before anything had actually failed. People had laughed at those habits. Abram had laughed too. Standing alone in the dim room, he finally saw them differently. What he had mistaken for fear had always been preparation. What looked excessive during easy seasons became harder to dismiss when conditions stopped being easy. He picked up the old level and turned it over in his hands. Then, he put it back. When Abram returned to the main room, he gathered rope, blankets, and heavy coats. The decision was made. As soon as the wind eased enough to travel, the family would leave the house and head north. Toward the cabin of the brother he had once sent away. Dawn was still hours away when the wind finally weakened. Not enough to make travel safe, only enough to make it possible. Abram wrapped his wife and children in blankets, then tied a rope between them, one person after another. If visibility vanished completely, nobody would be lost in the snow. Under ordinary conditions, the trip to Finnick's cabin was short. The storm had turned it into something else. The world beyond the farm existed only a few yards at a time. Fence posts appeared and disappeared. Clumps of brush became landmarks. More than once, Abram stopped and searched for bearings while snow swept across the ground around his boots. The cold worked steadily. By the time the cabin came into view, his fingers barely responded. A faint yellow glow floated through the storm. Nothing more. Yet it was enough. Abram led the family toward it. 3 knocks struck the door. The sound disappeared into the wind almost immediately. A moment later, the latch moved. Finnick opened the door. Warm light spilled onto the snow. For an instant, Abram tried to speak. Thoughts crowded together faster than words could follow. The farm, the argument, the spring morning when he had told his brother to leave. None of the sentences survived long enough to be spoken. Finnick never asked for them. Before Abram could gather himself, the younger man reached forward and lifted the smallest child into his arms. Martha was already unfolding a blanket beside the entrance. On the sleeping platform above, Eli shifted over to make room. The entire exchange lasted only seconds. Then the family stepped inside. Abram had spent months dismissing the stove as an oversized burden that consumed space and money. Standing in front of it now, he noticed something he had never considered. The warmth did not come from one direction. It seemed to exist throughout the room. Brick radiated it. Stone radiated it. Even the air felt different. Behind him, the storm continued battering the walls. Inside, another sound emerged. For the first time in days, one of his children stopped crying from the cold. Abram lowered his head slightly and listened. Nobody said anything. Nothing needed to be said. News traveled during the brief lulls between waves of the storm. One family arrived, then another. Caleb Mercer brought Ruth and the children after the last accessible portion of his woodpile disappeared beneath drifts taller than a man. Jeremiah Boone came carrying a canvas tool bag and the remaining dry fuel he had managed to save. Silas Crow arrived last, ice crusted across his coat, with no wagon behind him for the first time in years. By evening, more than a dozen people occupied a cabin built for 3. The stove continued working. The situation around it had changed. Every additional person added warmth, but they also added moisture. Wet boots steamed near the masonry. Breath collected on windows. Frost formed along the corners of the glass. Each time the door opened for another arrival, precious heat escaped into the storm. Finnick adjusted. Instead of sealing the cabin as tightly as possible, he opened a small vent high on the sheltered side of the building and maintained a narrow intake gap near the entrance. Fresh air moved through the room in a controlled path. Warmth mattered, but stale air could become dangerous. long before the temperature did. The firing schedule changed as well. Rather than pushing a single oversized burn through the stove, Finnick used two shorter fires. One came before sunrise. The other arrived late in the afternoon. The masonry heated more evenly, and the system remained easier to manage under the heavier load. Children occupied the warm sleeping platform. Adults settled around the base of the stove beneath blankets and coats. Outside, darkness spread across the basin. One distant window after another lost its light. Inside the Voss cabin, people listened to the wind and waited for morning. By the 13th day, the wind had finally begun to weaken. Snow still drifted across Judith Basin, but it no longer erased footprints the moment they appeared. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, people could imagine the storm ending. Inside the Voss cabin, attention slowly shifted away from survival and toward understanding. Jeremiah Boone spent part of an afternoon examining the stove. He rested a hand against different sections of the masonry, then used a thin iron rod to trace the locations of the hidden channels beneath the surface. What interested him most was not the heat itself, it was the draft. The stove continued drawing properly, despite the long path traveled by the smoke. That realization forced him to reconsider an assumption he had held for years. The winding passages were not weakening the fire. They were reclaiming heat that ordinary stoves usually surrendered to the sky. Across the room, Caleb Mercer found himself studying the woodpile instead. Earlier in the winter, he would have judged a heating system by how quickly it warmed a cabin. Now a different question seemed more important. How long could that warmth remain after the fire ended? The answer sat quietly in the brickwork around him. Silas Crow reached a conclusion of his own. For years, success had meant delivering more wood to more homes. The storm exposed the limits of that idea. Roads vanished. Wagons stopped moving. Quantity alone could not solve every problem. Properly dried fuel, used efficiently, suddenly looked more valuable than simply hauling larger loads. Meanwhile, Abram spent much of his time near the stove. He rarely spoke about the past. The argument from spring remained untouched. One evening, he crouched beside the clean-out doors at the base of the masonry and studied them for several minutes. Finally, he asked where the first channel turned downward. Finnick picked up a piece of charcoal. The back of an empty flour barrel became a drawing surface. A few simple lines appeared. The firebox. The first bend. The second. The final rise toward the chimney. Abram watched carefully. Then Finnick handed him the charcoal. Without a word, Abram copied the path himself. Around them, the conversation continued. Children slept. Water warmed beside the stove. Wind brushed softly against the walls. Nobody revisited old insults. Nobody argued over who had been right. The storm had already settled that question. All that remained was understanding why. The blizzard ended. Winter did not. For weeks afterward, Montana remained locked beneath snow, ice, and hard wind. Water still had to be carried indoors. Frost still gathered around corners of the windows. A few drafts continued finding their way through cracks in the cabin walls. Life remained difficult, yet the rhythm inside the Voss cabin never changed. The stove carried the family through February and deep into March. Each evening, a measured fire disappeared into the firebox. Hours later, the masonry continued returning that energy to the room. The woodpile diminished slowly. When the first signs of spring finally appeared along the southern slopes, fuel still remained under shelter. The winter had delivered its verdict, and long before the snow was gone, people began acting on it. Caleb Mercer made the first visible change. After years of trusting heat that arrived fast and vanished just as quickly, he removed the iron stove from its place against the north wall. During the summer, a smaller masonry heater rose near the center of his cabin. Jeremiah Boone found himself unexpectedly busy. The blacksmith did not abandon his trade. Instead, he adapted it. Stove doors, dampers, clean-out covers, hinges, and iron fittings for masonry heaters began leaving his forge. Metal and brick worked together rather than competing against one another. Silas Crow changed his business as well. The storm had taught him that emergency demand could disappear the moment roads became impassable. He improved the roofs over his wood storage areas and focused on properly seasoned fuel. Fewer customers bought wood in desperation. More customers bought it in preparation. The change lasted. At the old family farm, another project quietly took shape. One spring morning, several floorboards came up in the main room. Beneath them, Abram marked the outline of a foundation. Finnick arrived carrying tools. Neither brother mentioned the argument from the previous year. They did not discuss the day the wagon left the farm. No apology was requested. None was needed. Stone after stone settled into place beneath the floor. The work itself carried the meaning. Side by side, the brothers built the foundation for a new stove. Years later, many details of that winter faded from memory. Storms came and went. Neighbors moved away. Buildings changed. Yet one image stayed with Eli Voss. He remembered waking before sunrise and placing a hand on warm brick. The fire had burned out long ago. Darkness still filled the room. Outside, the world remained frozen. The heat was still there. That memory followed him, long after childhood ended. Nature never congratulated Finnick Voss. It never praised his planning. It never announced that he had been right. The blizzard simply removed every excuse for calling preparation foolish. When the test arrived, the brick stove held its warmth. His family stayed warm all winter. And the knowledge remained long after the fire was gone.